Welcome everyone that has joined us today. I really appreciate you making the time for this. This is a very busy time. My name is Alfonso Medenia. I'm the head of climate action and green transition at ECDPM, and I will introduce today's webinar on African green industrialization, where we want to discuss opportunities for we call a new phase of Africa-EU cooperation. Now, before we start, the event will be recorded. The recording will be made available afterwards. We will send you an update after the webinar. We encourage you to react and share your questions, but given that we have quite a large number of people already, please do so using the chat or Q&A. Some of you may be joining on YouTube, so to be able to comment or ask a question, you may have to use a Google account for that. So today, my colleague Purva Karkare will introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. My colleague Bruce Byers kindly also volunteered to summarize the proceedings afterwards. But before that, I'd like to give a very quick update on our research and how and why we've started looking at this issue. So this webinar today really marks for us the end of a multi-year research program. It is something that we started in 2023, where we focused on the political economy of green industrialization in African countries. So this is a project where we do deep dive studies on opportunities for African economies in a variety of sectors. So we look at clean tech manufacturing, specifically a battery value chain. We look at mineral processing, options for resource-based industrialization. We have looked at energy-intensive industries, green hydrogen economies, fertilizer production, but also decarbonizing iron and steel. And of course, none of this really happens in isolation. So we also look at the trade dimension and the EU-Africa trade dimension specifically. As these economies are moving into green industries, prioritizing renewables, we ask questions like how to navigate and respond to specific EU trade measures like the carbon border adjustment mechanism that came into force in 2023. I will not go into some of the specifics of this because it is quite a lot. For that, I really invite you to go onto our website or get in touch with some of us directly. My colleagues will also share links in the chat to an overview page where much of this research is available. But I want to say just a few quick points, because across all of these different projects, what we see is that there's a lot of opportunities, and opportunities do exist for African countries specifically to leverage their green industries or emerging green industries to break through this commodity dependent cycle and build positions in global green tech and energy value chains. But it's also very clear that the pathways towards this are fundamentally different for different countries, different regions. And it's also very clear that the opportunities that exist for some African countries in and across these different sectors really deeply intertwined with the industrial policies in major industrialized centers, including Europe. And that's really the core of today's webinar, because what we also see is that all of this is really taking place in a completely different or rapidly changing environment. What we see today is economic chaos, escalating trade wars. All of these create major new or additional risks and potential costs for developing countries and economies. And in a way, on the European side, which is something that we as ECDPM look at quite a lot, we see that green industries in third countries, in developing countries, are really also increasingly seen through this lens of industrial competitiveness, European and economics and energy security. And in a way, we're entering into a much more transactional phase of European partnerships. That doesn't mean that it's all sort of doom and gloom. This can also create opportunities. Some of us have started working on things like green iron imports, which could be or could form a basis for connecting or better connecting energy intensive industries between European and some African countries. But for today's discussion, we really want to delve into a number of questions around this new phase, or what this means to enter into a new phase of international partnership on green industries. So really how to make the most of new green industrial deals being negotiated. For example, discussions ongoing with South Africa, or what the trade and partnership architecture is needed to really deliver shared benefits on green industries, and how to also better link with these African industrialization interests and policies. So finally, before I hand over, I also just want to say that this project over the past couple of years has really been the launchpad of a lot of different new initiatives for ECDPM, so including new partnerships with some of the speakers that you will hear from today. So I'm really glad to say that this, in a way, is really also the start of something new and the start of a lot more to come. So with that, over to you, Purva.
Thank you, Alfonso. So I won't give you any kind of background to why we're doing this, because Alfonso already gave us a nice background to it. I'll get straight into introducing our panel today. To start with, we have Theo Achiampong, who is economist and a political risk analyst, looking at the interactions between natural resource extraction and public finance management. And his expertise really include precisely the kind of things that you would think about when you're talking industrialization. So looking at energy policy, fiscal regime, contract negotiations, local content, and investment promotion. At the same time, he also has an eye on complex political, business, and sovereign risks. So this could include corruption, expropriation, or fiscal shocks, looking specifically at sub-Saharan Africa and how they kind of influence how these policies that I mentioned above actually work in practice. So I would say he is quite well placed to talk to us about some of the observed dynamics at national level in sub-Saharan Africa. Also, Theo happens to be an associate at ECDPM. Next up, we have Nimrod Zog, who is a development economist, currently working as the Chief Research Officer at the Climate and Economic Development Research Program at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance, which is part of University of Cape Town. And this research program focuses on climate-compatible structural transformation in Africa and the role for development banks therein. Before this, Nimrod worked as the Deputy Director General for Sectors in the South African Department for Trade, Industry and Competition. And he was also the non-executive director at the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa. So even though he's not representing the government, the fact that he has worked previously in the government and has seen how bureaucracies work can also give us a different perspective of how governments themselves look at green industrialization. After that, we have Caroline Nouwen, who is co-founder of the Climate Action Platform Africa, or CAP-A. They are a systems orchestrator focusing on inclusive economic growth through climate action. Caroline is an engineer by background, and she leads CAP-A's green industrialization work and provides strategic guidance on partnerships. So you can see that she's also quite well placed to talk about partnerships here. She has also led CAP-A's work on green industrialization, especially on the Nairobi Declaration, and helped set up the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative. Before this, she worked at Dalberg, McKinsey, but also at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. And we also have Tibor Stelbaxi, who is principal advisor on energy diplomacy at the European External Action Service. So really, they're dealing with the external dimension of EU's energy policy and implications for the energy transition worldwide. His career actually, interestingly, started as a member of the accession negotiation team for EU integration in Hungary. So as well as talking about energy policies, he's quite well aware of internal politics within the EU and how that shapes its view towards the outside world. So there you can really see the panel that we have is quite well placed to be talking about the things that we are going to talk about today. So maybe I can start with you, Theo. In terms of green industrialization, I mean, it's become kind of a buzzword, but when countries, especially African countries, they also see the minerals that they have as playing a central role in the green transition, global green transition. And they talk about using these resources to actually spur economic development, which in some circles you would also call resource-based industrialization. So could you maybe start us off by laying out some of the opportunities that countries could be exploring when talking about green industrialization? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Paul and Alfonso and Tim, and it's really great to be here. And I welcome the opportunity to interact and also learn. You're very right in terms of I like the word the green industrialization because this has been around since the 1960s for many of the African economies post-independence wanting to leverage their mineral resources to drive broader structural transformation. So it's actually not new in that sense. I think what is new now is the pace or the emphasis around the green transition minerals and some of these minerals that hitherto were not like the major focus in many of the economies on the continent. So like cobalt and lithiums and the likes. But for others like copper, that's been around for several years in a number of the countries, and same with iron ore and bauxite, and turning that into aluminium. But then there have been major structural impediments why this has not translated into broader transformation in many of our economies. Some of them externally led, others due to the local political economic dynamics in many of these economies. But I think nonetheless, there are opportunities, rightly, as we've indicated. And before I just come to that, my sort of worry really is that for many of our African countries that I certainly have engaged with the policymakers, they want to do everything within the ecosystem or the value chain. So everything from mining to processing to creating the associated downstream industries. And I think that is probably not the right approach. And I'll explain that in a moment, that there is an opportunity to develop, and some countries have some factor advantages within certain segments of that value chain that I think they are better placed to leverage that within the continent, and then others can do some of the downstream, aspects of it. So it becomes imperative for me in terms of opportunities to really look at it within which segments of the mineral processing value chain countries are better positioned. And part of the work that I've been doing the last 6 months or so is trying to benchmark and look at, giving some set of factors, where do certain countries sit along, these clusters. So, for example, when it comes to the processing of the minerals across 6 different value chains that I have looked at myself. So these value chains would comprise, for example, looking at lithium, looking at nickel, looking at cobalt, copper, manganese, graphite, the platinum group metals, and the rare earths. What is beginning or coming across to me in my sort of initial work and the finding is that, for example, on lithium, you're finding places like Zimbabwe and Ghana relatively better positioned on the processing side or the midstream side of the market. And if you take nickel as another example, you've got the likes of South Africa and Madagascar also being better positioned on the midstream side of the market. Likewise, if we take copper and cobalt, for sure, DRC and Zambia feature quite prominently in there, and then a few other ones for the rare earths and the platinum group. Again, South Africa comes actually quite, strong on the top of that list. But what these countries are doing is precisely focusing on certain clusters within that value chain that they're good at doing. And then on the downstream side, on the processing side, you're actually seeing countries that don't necessarily have those materials, but have other factor advantages like on the electricity and the labor and the other things, being much more competitive within the African context. So, for example, for Kenya, comes up when you're looking at assembling, battery packs or modules for 2 and 3 wheelers. The market is really less on making EVs or Tesla type EVs on the continent, but the opportunity really on the transport or the mobility side is within 2 and 3 wheelers, as well as making battery packs for energy storage solutions. So it's quite a diverse ecosystem to sort of wrap up. And instead of the earlier attempt where countries were trying to do everything within that value chain, we're seeing some heterogeneity, with others focusing more on where they have some relative factor advantages that they can use to drive their transformation.
Right. Yeah, thanks a lot for this. I mean, this in many ways also echoes the work that we have done. Well, one thing, as you were saying, is that one country might not be able to have all the capacities and capabilities for all segments in the value chain, because there's really quite a lot happening there. And second, what you also raised with the electric vehicles and the Kenya example is to try and focus on those products for which there's actually demand in the wider regional market. This kind of also weaves into my next question, which is actually for you, Nimrod. I mean, some of these conversations, I suppose, are also taking place in South Africa as well. But South Africa is the largest, if not the largest, one of the largest economies in Africa. And it has a large market that it can look at as well. But many other African countries don't have that kind of market. And this is where I think thinking about regional integration and regional markets also becomes interesting. And now, at the same time, there's also this conversation around the African continental free trade area. So maybe I wanted to ask you if you can give us a sense of how green industrialization is being talked about at the regional level. And if you can give us maybe an example where you see this happening. Thanks.
Thanks, Puva. So I mean, just one kind of framing remark, which only occurred to me 30 seconds ago. So I think we just need to be careful how we frame this discussion about the economic relationship between the EU and Africa in terms of their relative challenges. So Africa as a whole its predominant challenge is not a decarbonization challenge. It's a growth and structural transformation challenge. Because on average, the continent consumes about, or accounts for about 0.9 tons per person of carbon per annum, whereas the EU accounts for 10.5 tons per annum. And I'm mentioning this not to suggest that there aren't very significant areas for cooperation, but to highlight that we shouldn't be, entirely focused on that these areas for cooperation and collaboration that tie very closely to the EU's desire to decarbonize doesn't kind of crowd out other ideas or other possibilities for African structural transformation. So having said that, I think the AFCFTA does present a very significant opportunity to the EU, and I'm sure many people have heard these numbers before, but approximately 1.3 billion people, of which 600 million still do not have energy access, with projections that this would grow to around 2.3 billion people by 2043, a collective GDP of around $3.4 trillion US. And with that, and with the kind of intra-African kind of opening up of trade, further opening up of trade, it does present opportunities for domestic but also foreign investors, such as from the EU, to invest and produce and serve that broader AFCFTA market rather than simply a particular country within the AFCFTA. There are quite significant complementarities that could be built on in the trade and investment relationship between the EU and Africa. One very important factor to take into account is how the balance of payments constraint, particularly African countries, are feeling at the moment partly as a byproduct of the debt crisis, is an inhibitor to the EU exporting more onto the continent. So to put it another way, in order to export more, the EU needs to import more from African countries and strategize about how to do that. There are numerous opportunities linked to the EU's decarbonization agenda, which include the fact that the continent has tremendous renewable resources, which can generate renewable energy much more cheaply than the EU can generate electricity, which is a major constraint to the industrial sector. The opportunities to produce things like green iron and steel, which I think others will elaborate on, opportunities around the critical minerals value chains. But again, let's not kind of leave out perhaps some of these opportunities definitely to be pursued. But I think part of the conversation is perhaps leaving out other opportunities. One is that there's a great neglect in the kind of developmental discourse about the importance and the opportunities within the agricultural sector. And so economists from SOAS University have coined this term, the industrialisation of freshness. So the enormous kind of industrial upgrading and structural transformation that is possible within parts of agriculture itself, like the horticultural products, getting fresh horticultural products into demanding export markets comes with a very valuable price tag. Light and medium tech manufacturing, locating this on the continent, using, for instance, institutional mechanisms like green industrial hubs or industrial parks. And then I think two last points. One is that I think for the EU, as it's discovering now, there already is a premium on having stable trade and investment partnerships. Obviously, that's not to say that there aren't difficulties experienced on the continent. But I think that looking at deepening those partnerships with African countries is extremely important, because they're far less likely compared to, say, one major trade partner of the EU on the other side of the Atlantic, waking up in the morning and making fundamentally new decisions about the nature and the rules of the game. And then lastly, the last point I would make is that the AFCFTA is important as a market, but it's also important as an institution. And I think because it offers an opportunity to, on the one hand, frame Africa's green industrialization objectives, and that's something that we've been working as a school quite closely in assisting the AFCFTA Secretariat, but also as an interlocutor, where EU states or the EU as an entity doesn't necessarily have to go to 55 individual African countries, but has a potential partner to engage with that broadly represents the interests of, or the views of many African countries.
Right. No, thanks a lot for this. I mean, also to say first, to your first point, we do completely take the point of looking how, from the perspective of the EU, there's a decarbonization agenda, or now increasingly also about energy and critical raw material security agenda. And we are trying to see how to marry that with the economic transformation agenda on the African side. So that point is very well taken. And also that we could be thinking about sectors beyond minerals and energy to also look at agriculture, because at the end of the day, that's where much of the transformation potential also lies. So those points are very well taken. But you also make some really interesting points about looking at the AFCFTA as a market and also the balance of payment constraints that you talked about. So, Caroline, going to you, taking into account also what Nimrod said, that in order to export more to the African market, the EU may also need to import more from it in the first place for these balance of payment constraints. How do you see EU-Africa partnership or relations really evolving in a way that there are benefits for both sides? And I'm saying this because, as Nimrod was also saying, we are operating in an environment where Africa or the EU, none of them operate in a vacuum. So you need to be taking into account what's happening, how the relations are evolving with other partners. And also given the discussions taking place increasingly on the EU side of the need to engage on the basis of interests rather than only needs or some kind of charity. So it's not about doing things because it's a good thing to do, but really trying to get something out of it for both sides. So based on your work, how do you see the two sides really benefiting by working with each other? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Purva, for that question, and thanks for Theo and Nimrod for their remarks and for setting it up so well. And I actually want to pick up on some of the things that both of them said. So Theo started by saying that this industrial ambition for Africa has not been new and has been around since the 60s. And one of the reflections he then made is what's new, and he reflected on the need for transition materials. There's another thing that is fundamentally new now, and that is at the core of this question of mutual beneficiation, and that is the fact that the energy source of the future, electricity, has different characteristics from the energy sources of the past. So past locations on industrial choices and energy intensive industrial choices were dictated to a large degree by the fact that fossil fuels are very energy dense and relatively cheap to transport. So you could get your energy to where you wanted to deploy it. That is not true for electrons. When you transport them over a long distance, that's costly and you have a lot of transmission losses. So it makes a ton more sense to use electricity, renewable electricity, and convert it into something else, an energy carrier, an industrial product, an intermediate product, close to where you produce the electricity. And that is a fundamental characteristic that defines this potential future Africa-Europe relationship, because the ambitions that Europe has around both the size and the nature of its industrial activity for the future does not connect to the ability Europe has to generate that electricity for itself. It does not add up. If you look at Europe's decarbonization objectives for both retail and industrial use, and you look at how quickly and at what cost they can generate the renewable electricity to power all of that, there's a gap. And that gap is a gap that Africa can fill in a way that Africa benefits from and Europe benefits from. There are portions of value change that are disproportionately energy intense and that are not smart to be done by parts of the world that are struggling to expand their energy generation, their renewable energy generation, their grids, their ability to process that at the pace that other parts of the world can do it. So it makes no sense to do a lot of the incredibly energy intense first steps of mineral processing, whether it's the transitional minerals Theo spoke about, or whether it's iron ore, bauxite, and a couple of other of the more sort of traditional minerals that Africa for a long time has been mining and sending off the continent as ore rather than as processed goods. It makes very little sense for Africa to continue mining those and sending them off to other parts of the world where they are then being processed and then partially being sent back to Africa, right? And increasingly, actually, because of the infrastructure building needs on the African continent as well. It makes a ton more sense for that primary processing to partially happen closer to where you both find the primary materials and where you have that massive untapped renewable energy potential that Nimrod spoke about, which is the African continent, right? Higher capacity factors, lower seasonality, lower competing use because you have less of a decarbonization challenge. So you can deploy new renewable energy generation capacity immediately towards industrial processes. And I think in the second part of this conversation, we'll get into some of the trade-offs and some of the challenges, and doesn't that lead to decarbonization, et cetera. But there are portions of value chains, and iron and steel and aluminum are two really relevant and important ones, where exactly for Europe to achieve its decarbonization objectives, they're going to have to import green industrial inputs and products rather than just the raw ores, because otherwise they will never actually achieve their decarbonization objectives. And Africa is well served to build up that industry, because that is what helps Africa invest in an expansion of its energy systems and an expansion of its generation capacity, which can help address energy access challenges, a diversification of its economies. So to your question, Purva, of the mutual self-interest, right? No country has actually industrialized on the back of another country's altruism. We've had efforts of development assistance and partnership, but they're never big enough to actually kickstart entire industrial development in other parts of the world. But this kind of reality of really high climate ambitions in Europe, marked with a real energy constraint in Europe, and massive untapped renewable energy potential in Africa, the availability of the land, of the labor, of the primary materials, and the desire for green industrialization and kickstarting that diversification of economies is a potential very beautiful set of partnerships that don't rely on do-gooding or a feeling of wanting to do the right thing, but are simple, basic economic competitive advantages that can strengthen each other.
This is perfect. I mean, you built up the case really well for why it makes sense for EU and Africa to work together when it comes to green industrialization. I mean, looking just at Theo's point about how at the national level, not everything can be done individually. Nimrod's point about looking at AFCFTA as a market and thinking about how you can put together capabilities to produce something. Your point about partnerships, why it makes sense. Maybe that also gives a nice segue to come to you, Tibor. I mean, at the EAS, you also look at EU's external relations, not just with Africa, but the whole spectrum of partners, right? And now, I mean, as various speakers have pointed out, and even Alfonso, you're looking at how transatlantic relations are not on a stable footing, to say the least. With China, there are concerns about strategic rivalry or what have you. And then there's security concerns with Russia. So in all of these sort of dilemmas that the EU is also facing, where do you think EU-Africa relations and this economic sense or commercial sense that it makes to work together, where does that fit in, do you think, in the larger conversation that's happening inside of Europe? And as they're thinking about reindustrializing Europe to face these different dilemmas. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very privileged to be in this event and this very great panel with colleagues here. Well, indeed, I think we are living in a challenging times, and And as the Chinese saying, it says very interesting times, and we never know that this is a blessing or this is something of wrong wish to live in interesting times. But anyway, this is really the reality now. And from European perspective, what we can see now, it's very accelerating since, let's say, 20th of January, but also earlier there was already very clear sign for this, which was very excellently summarized in the Draghi report, that the major geopolitical changes what we are realizing. And I think on this, it will be more and more a kind of need that from changing from the kind of reliable alliances and partnerships in the world, which were, I would say, rather plenty. First of all, the transatlantic with the US. This is a changing situation, and Europe needs to build more on its own capacities and or resources there. It does not mean at all that we are not looking for partnerships in the world, and it will remain even more after the changes in the US than it was earlier. And from this point of view, I think one of the first candidates is definitely Africa here. And if you are looking all the neighborhoods what we have in Europe, so you mentioned Russia, but I can also the Middle East, also now the relations with the US and the transatlantic relationships. So in the neighborhood, the Mediterranean and Africa, the two is in one continent is the same, is the most important potential partner for Europe. And there are some points that I would like just as a first element to mention here. That one is that Africa is very, very, very colorful. So we cannot speak about Africa as such. It's totally different from Egypt to Senegal or Sierra Leone to South Africa or Kenya or others. So we need to really make a differentiation among the countries, and I think this is a very important number one criteria if you talk about the future partnership. The second is that, as I think Theo mentioned, that in Africa the main point is not decarbonization. So if you look at, for example, the Africa Energy Summit in January, the major topic was, and the major topic is still in the sub-Saharan region, is the access to electricity. So it's a totally different story than what we have in Europe on the decarbonization and how to green the industry and how to do the energy transition toward the sustainable and green energy sources. So we need taking into account all these elements. But I think before me, the speakers already talk about the potentials and on the possibilities to work with Africa. If I was talking about the diversity of Africa, then definitely the Mediterranean region. So from Morocco to the Middle East, this is really the closest neighborhood to Europe, and with great potential on cooperation. Let it be greening, which is decarbonization, which here in this region is relevant, or critical raw materials, or the energy transition. And I think you know very well that there will be a new strategy on the Mediterranean, a pact for the Mediterranean. There is a new Directorate General for the Mediterranean, which shows the increasing focus on this area. And if I may just to summarize very briefly that what is the intention here, it's really to build on partnerships which takes into account mutual interest of the partners here, so the EU and the North African countries, and to build on the advantages what this region has, and build on the synergies what we can do with Europe together. Let it be the production of clean industrial products there, and this is the geographical because they are in the neighborhood. This is something which can work well because of the labor market and the labor possibilities. This is something that we can use in Europe. In the same time, we can create value there locally and to contribute to the economic growth this country. The renewable and the hydrogen is also a potential on this. Although in hydrogen, I think we need still a homework in Europe to decide that for what to use the hydrogen, and not to create a kind of feelings that Europe will buy all the hydrogen which is produced there, or the green hydrogen, of course, which is produced there. And we cannot do this until or unless we don't know that for what to use the hydrogen in Europe. And on the sub-Saharan regions, I fully agree that it's no point to just to continue, which was from the 60s, that the minerals is brought by Europe and to take them, but definitely to build on a kind of partnerships where, and this is, I think, the key word from my side, that we need to look at it. We need to understand well together with partner countries that what is the interest of these countries, what is the interest of Europe, and how this interest can be mutually aligned and to explore and to work together. I think that Europe has a very good offer to Africa, and this is a kind of really a kind of reliable partner, the biggest donor in the past, if we are talking about global gateway and investments in Africa as well. A market of 450 million people, a single market with a very clear legal system. So if African countries realize this, and we can convince them that this is a mutual interest to work together, taken into account very clearly the interest of these countries as well, and what they want on the industrialization or access to energy, access to electricity, and all the others, then it provides a very good possibility for mutual cooperation there, and it can balance and ease and maybe to compensate a bit on all these challenges what we see now in the worldwide, and since I think the basic interest from Africa and from Europe is very same on this, if we are talking about the reliable partnerships, then we can find also the ways for this. You know that we are preparing the 7th EU-Africa Union Summit later this year. In May, there will be also a ministerial meeting. So the preparations are already ongoing for this. You know, as I mentioned, that there will be the Pact for Mediterranean as well, which is a flagship initiative from Europe. So I see a lot of changes and a lot of focus on Africa comparing to the past, and I see even in this changing geopolitical landscape a huge potential for the cooperation with Africa. Thanks.
Right. No, thanks a lot for this. I mean, some of your points, they already get into some kind of reality check, right? So in terms of framing, yes, it makes sense for EU and Africa to work together. I mean, we can call it partnership or develop relations that focus on particular sectors. But what I then also kind of get from your intervention is that things also need to happen in order to make true of this vision that both partners then have. So to look then more at what's happening in practice, maybe if I can come back to you, Theo, I mean, you heard already, and I also buy into these points, that on the African side, the conversation is much more about electrification rather than decarbonization, and that all countries are quite diverse, so we can't be talking about one Africa. But also, you yourself in your first intervention already highlighted some of the challenges of making true of these ambitions on green industrialization. So my question to you is still going back to what in your view, is holding countries back. Just to give you an example, for instance, do we think green industrialization is really going to give an opportunity for African countries to quote unquote leapfrog and circumvent some of the existing challenges that they have had? Or is green industrialization somehow actually reinforcing the existing power imbalances and inequities and actually reinforcing Africa's dependence on the exports of raw materials to the rest of the world? Because only having all the wealth in the ground does not really mean anything unless you can actually exploit them with the right kinds of investments and right kind of skills. And my question would be, are those skills and investments really coming up? Or are there any other kind of factors that are holding back Africa's green industrialization? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, we could spend the whole day just unpacking unpacking this. Yeah. But I'm more on the optimistic side. I think there are potentials, right? I also take cognizance of the fact that there are major concerns in these whole partnerships and relationships about, the same old extractivist model that we've had in the past. And it's just another form of, the extension of the neo-colonialization that's been going on for a while now. I think back to the question that you asked, as is sometimes said, resources are not, they become. And you really need some sort of factors to be available to you as a country or as an industry to be able to sort of transform. And part of the work that I have been doing the last few months is really trying to go deeper and understand to the question, what is hindering, right, African countries from industrializing, and particularly or specifically within the new green tech or green industrial clusters, how, can that be sort of turned around? And I think there are 6 competitiveness factors that I've sort of been looking at or come up with in my work. The first one is on the availability of the resource and proximity. So for many of our countries, for sure they have these green minerals, etc., etc. But is that enough? No. The second factor is on the skilled workforce, and also linked to the R&D capabilities. Third is on the industrial infrastructure and the ecosystems. And this includes, issues of energy, and I'll give an example of that in a moment. Fourth is around the government incentives, the policy structures, the external trade policies that they're signing with different markets. Number 5, the issues around the stable investment climate, the governance issues that comes up. And I think number 6, increasingly more coming to the fore, is the whole issue of ESG standards, especially if you're looking at getting investments from Europe or other markets. And we can unpack all these 6 factors into some set of sub-factors. But of these 6, the 2 that increasingly comes up, when you do the analysis and look at the data, is the being closer to the market or having the proximity, and then also really having the local demand that can catalyze or create the economies of scale that are needed, for one to benefit from it. And if you look at energy within the infrastructure as an example, and I'm just going to use the aluminum industry to just illustrate this point. If you want to take bauxite and turn it into alumina, and then further smelter into aluminum, just to do aluminum smelting, which is where the value really is, you need on average about 13,000 kilowatt hours of electricity just to make 1 ton of aluminum. The average household electricity consumption in the US is about 30 kilowatt hours per day, which is about similar to, if you take the industrial economies on the continent, the leading ones, South Africa and Egypt is around 22 kilowatt hours a day. And then if you take Ghana as an example, that also has a smelter, that's about 4 kilowatt hours of consumption a day. So you just take your 13,000 kilowatt hours to make a ton, divide by the average consumption, and for the numbers basically comes up to make a ton of aluminum, that's going to require as much electricity as 400 houses or homes would use in the US in a day, or in the case of Ghana, you're looking at about 3,200 households, as much of the power that they're going to consume in a day just to make just 1 kilo of aluminium. And number two, this electricity also has to be cheap. So in China and other markets, they're producing or selling electricity to their smelters below 5 cents a kilowatt hour. In many of our economies on the continent, within the industrial sector, you're looking at an average 10 cents a kilowatt hour for power. And if you want to compete with China and not just Europe or not just America, you've got to be able to provide this power much cheaper. If you want to develop the industrial, ecosystem. And these are some of the real trade-offs that countries are having to actually make. So in the case of Ghana, for example, which I know quite well, there's a discussion that's going on at the moment. Do we dedicate all of the legacy hydropower to the smelter? And what in turn then means it's going to be cheaper. Number two, the hydro is going to be, meet all the green credentials under CBAM and things like that if they want to export. But what it actually means in terms of trade-off is that the cost of power for everybody else in the country is going to go up, because you're not having to rely more on the thermal power that generates about 70% of the electricity mix. And this is where, again, the opportunity then comes in. So for example, if you're bringing in more distributed solar onto the grid, then that allows you to actually bring down the blended cost of power for everyone else, whilst dedicating the more heavier baseload power for industry and other things. So the impediments are many. The structural constraints are many along those 6 clusters that I talked about. But I do think that they can be overcome. And the focus is not just on policy or those static processes, but it's also about how you leverage the industrial, policy too. So some strategic actions on infrastructure, on incentives or governance, on processing, on training the skills or the skills base that are needed for these new green industrial clusters. And we do have some initiatives already happening at the continental level. So there's a battery institute, for example, that is a collaboration between Zambia and DRC that already is happening, and that can be further, strengthened. But it really fundamentally comes down to the whole value chain and the ecosystems and how different countries stack up against these things. And the energy bit in terms of the infrastructure is really one of the major, constraints that has to be addressed.
Thanks a lot for that, Theo. I mean, what I really like that you also talk about trade-offs, because indeed, I mean, it depends on how you look at it, but there are some choices that countries will have to make. What you talk about energy, is it going to be energy for industry or energy for households? Other than that, I can also think about short-term and long-term priorities. Do we export, if we're talking about minerals, do we export the minerals now and get the foreign exchange that is needed to import other things which we deem important for our economic growth or development? Or do we forego those foreign exchange now in order to have long-term processing involved and value addition? Also, there could be a trade-off between employment and value addition, because let's also be honest that green industries by themselves are not going to be the major creator of jobs. There is going to be job creation, but they're not going to be the main ones. For that, you in fact will have to look at agriculture, as Nimrod was saying. But Nimrod, I guess coming to you then, because you also mentioned about looking at the AFCFTA as an interlocutor. If we look at kind of these competing objectives that countries are faced with at the national level, one can only imagine that trying to coordinate these between countries is that much more difficult. So I I guess my question to you is, do you see this happening at the regional level, or do you think things are happening differently, and the AFCFTA is providing either a different framing or a different way to try and resolve some of these issues that happen when you're talking about regional integration? Thanks.
Thanks, Purva. Look, I think the first thing to say is to be realistic about the AFCFTA as an institution. It's not in a position to form binding policy across African countries. It just simply doesn't have that legal status or power. So I think where it has a very important role to play is in setting out possible pathways for African countries to structurally transform in a climate compatible way, and building on opportunities from the green transition. I think the one of the main things to emphasize is probably that at the end of the day, and I think this builds on a point that Caroline made earlier, which is that a lot of this comes down to how demanding individual countries are in relation to their minerals, in relation to their industrialization strategies. Obviously, it needs to be realistic, but no one will come and process minerals just, as Caroline was saying, out of the goodness of their hearts. If one looks at DRC and Zambia, they've signed these very high-level MOUs about developing the Lobito corridor on the one hand, and producing everything from, producing the whole value chain going up to electric vehicles. And then you have a kind of competing railway on the East Coast running from the Zambian copper belt, which the Chinese are rehabilitating, the Tazara corridor. And I think that's really what's happening is it actually is all about accessing those resources, adding as little value to them as possible. But that's entirely understandable in a way, if those countries are not more demanding. And I think also realistic, because it's obviously very important to have access to critical battery minerals and so forth, but that is a necessary condition. It's by no means a sufficient condition. The real and the fundamental challenge is building up the industrial capabilities at scale to manufacture on an enormous scale if you want to be able to compete in these industries. And that's essentially where China has pulled ahead of everybody else. The US, the EU are struggling to compete. So I don't think it's impossible to build at least some of these capabilities and capture some of the value, but it needs to be realistic, and it really depends on how strategic and demanding the country that hosts the minerals is about how they leverage the most developmental outcomes from having those endowments of minerals.
Right. Now, thanks a lot for this. I think what you say also makes quite a lot of sense. I mean, firstly, that yes, the AFCFTA probably doesn't have that mandate even to come up with binding policies, so it doesn't have that legal status, but can provide these pathways. And when it comes to national levels, it's also as much about how ambitious these countries are while being realistic in terms of what they can achieve, be it in the short or medium term. Building on that then, Caroline, if I can come to you, if we're talking about EU-Africa relations, I mean, we talked about how we can in theory, make it about a win-win situation, right? Or where both sides get something out of it. But of course, as Nimrod's example of Lobito and Tazara also showed, there are some power asymmetries. And also a general shortfall in terms of what each partner is committing to the relationship and eventually what they are able to deliver. And it happens on both sides, EU as well as the African side, given notwithstanding all the diversity that exists therein. Can you maybe go a little bit more into some of these challenges, what they look like when we're talking about green industrialization based on your work? And I also see that there's a few questions in the comments section. So thank you already for addressing some of those. And if you wanted to bring those in your intervention, you're more than welcome to. Thanks.
Thank you, Purva. Yes, I kept an eye on the chat, and there's a couple of threads I want to connect in this contribution. But first, to your question around some of the challenges. So there are many, and what many of them have in common, I would say, is either a short-termism or false dichotomies. So let me actually give an example of that to illustrate that. So we've already spoken a little bit about industrialization or energy access when it comes to Africa, and there's some discussions on that in the thread in the chat as well. I think largely that is a question of a false dichotomy. It is not true that many Africans don't have access to energy because their governments decided to build massive industries and divert all their power to that. There is massive untapped renewable energy potential and massive energy poverty because the unmet energy demand does not present an investable, viable business case. It's as simple as that. And the reason for that is because they're often peri-urban and rural areas and people with low abilities to pay, and off-grid and mini-grid solutions are relatively costly compared to grid solutions when it comes to sort of total levelized cost of energy, and therefore they need cross-subsidies. And that kind of cross-subsidy happens all over the world. Like in parts of the world where everybody has energy access and people pay similar retail tariffs irrespective of where they live, there's all sorts of cross-subsidies in those systems, and there's all sorts of public investment in the grid backbone infrastructure. And African countries can't make those investments right now. Many of their power utilities have real strained balance sheets. Many countries have really high debt service burdens, et cetera, and that leaves them in that paradox of having massive untapped renewable energy potential and having really high energy poverty. And well-structured industrial anchor demand, ideally linked to international supply chains so that you overcome some of the structural risks around currency, et cetera, can actually form the investable case for expanding energy systems, for strengthening utilities, for investing in large-scale generation, which in turn allows you to cross-subsidize for energy access. It's not an automatic. So it's not as if, oh, all you need to do is just build some massive wind farms and solar farms to green all of your mineral processing, and automatically your energy access issue will get resolved. But it is a necessary but insufficient piece of the puzzle to actually strengthen the balance sheets of utilities, strengthen the investability in energy systems, and overcome some of these energy access issues. In the absence of large-scale industrial anchor demand, solving Africa's energy access problem continues to be a question that will suck in public and philanthropic resources, of which we have insufficient supply. I wish we had sufficient supply, that's a separate conversation, but we don't have sufficient supply to solve it with philanthropic and public resources. So we need to think about that differently. That's an example of a false dichotomy. An example of short-termism in some of these trade-offs is how sometimes Europe thinks about some of these things. So especially in the current sort of geopolitical pressures, questions around strategic independence and a worry about deindustrialization tend to turn into the exact same knee-jerk response that Theo spoke about for African countries in the past. We want to do everything ourselves. right? Sometimes the simplistic interpretation of what strategic independence for Europe means is that we're not dependent on anybody else. And that's not going to happen. It's not going to work, because guess what? Europe does not have access to all of the primary materials that it needs in the amount that it wants to feed its entire industry, not just power, but minerals as well, etc. So somewhere upstream, you always become dependent. And as I mentioned in my first set of remarks, it's not even the wisest choice from a competitiveness perspective, from a value add perspective, to actually try and do everything yourself when you have scarcity of certain inputs like energy. So we must think way more about strategic interdependence and actually finding partnerships where you build on your relative competitiveness. And this goes to the question that Tando asked in the chat, where he said, well, if Africa adds more value and sends more processed stuff to Europe, that will become more expensive for Europe. As Theo mentioned in his comments, if it isn't cheap, it won't sell, right? You have to be able to compete. Again, this is not it's not an effort to do this out of the goodness of your heart. Europe will only make the choice to purchase industrial half products from Africa if it is ultimately cheaper for them to do so than it is to produce it in Europe. And that's constantly the lens that you need to take. And that gets me to some of the comments that Inge and Kuda made in the chat around how do we need to structure policies and trade agreements between Europe and Africa for what I now call intrinsic climate competitiveness of the African continent to actually play out, right? For that to be an investable opportunity. And for that, we need to structure two things in different ways. The first is market access. The second is capital availability. And market access, there's some comments in the chat around CBAM, for example, where products and services need to be low embedded emissions. It is very important that we structure a set of rules that has the right scope, includes as much of the emissions of those products as possible, which CBAM currently does not do, and then has mechanisms for countries to properly prove their low embedded emissions in a way that allows them to access those markets, not on preferential terms, but on equitable terms. If some African countries are the best location to produce low embedded products and services that they can export to the European Union, it would be a global travesty, and I'm not using that word lightly, it would be a global travesty if we structured our trade agreements and the requirements of data and metrics in such a way that really low embedded products and services cannot access these markets. So that's the first thing. And there's a lot of detail that goes into that I won't be able to get into in this conversation, but I'm happy to talk about with anybody who wants to continue that conversation. And I know ECDPM has put a lot of work into thinking about what that could look like. And the second is about access to the right amount and appropriately priced capital. And Kuda made a comment on that around energy access and non-renewable sources. I'm sure many of you on this call are familiar with the research that the IEA does that consistently shows that renewable energy is the lowest cost of total LCOE cost of energy now, of all, even including storage, of all sources of electricity. But that critically depends on what the cost of capital is, because the upfront capex needed to invest in renewable energy is higher. And many African countries face very high costs of capital. And that's where sometimes that intrinsic competitiveness breaks down. So there's lots of things to resolve, Purva, and I'll pause here because I see the chat is blowing up and there's probably a lot more comments and questions that people would like to ask. But I think the most important thing for Europe and Africa is to think of this both in a really strategic and long-term way, and at the same time very clear-eyed when it comes to economics and competitiveness. This is not about a cute dream. Cute dreams don't drive industrialization. competitiveness drives industrialization, and then finding opportunities for strategic interdependence. And that requires thinking about partnering and investing probably in a slightly different way.
Perfect.
Let me pause here.
Thank you so much. I mean, I love that you use the word strategic interdependence as well, because this was also something we've made this point in other places as well. This is about interdependence and not overdependence or dependence, which somehow creates security concerns. But which also, I mean, you made so many excellent points, but I won't get into them. But I guess, Tibor, to come to you, when talking about precisely this angle of strategic interdependence, what comes to mind is that EU-Africa relations for green industrialization, this is not just a theoretical or even a development-related conversation, right? It is as much about a political ambition. So it also requires diplomacy. So Caroline made the point about how it is also important to think about competitiveness and value chains and how to bring them together. But to my mind, it is also just as much about diplomacy because it's a political ambition as well. And so my question to you would be, given how EU-Africa relations have evolved over the years, and given the fact that there are still these challenges that have perpetuated over so many years that persist even today when it comes to the right kinds of investments at the right price, as Caroline was also saying. What are some of the lessons, do you think, that the EU can draw when it deals with Africa in order to make these relations also be more fruitful? Because as again, all speakers have pointed out, and you as well, this is not a good to have working with African countries, but it's a must have for an energy poor Europe. What are some of the lessons that we can draw on what the EU can do differently or what the EU can do more of when they engage with African countries? Thanks.
Yes, thanks. I think it's a very, very pertinent question because the whole success of the partnership is depends on this. So in my view, the major issue is that it should be really based on the mutual interest, and we can call it interdependence as well. So it should be in a way that, as I mentioned also in my previous intervention, that we need to listen our partners and to understand what is their interest and what is their aim, and let it be whichever country in Africa. So from, as I mentioned, from Egypt to South Africa, Kenya to Senegal, and others. So it's very important to see and to build on this mutual interest and to find the synergies on this. It's not obvious, so we cannot expect that everybody will at first sight to recognize, both Europe and Africa, that what is this interest or common interest in the topic. So, we heard a lot of critics on the CBAM, but as it was mentioned also by Caroline, I think that, if it's CBAM is really regarded and acknowledged as an incentive for low embedded carbon production, so the greener production, and it will be equal to access to a big market for countries. And if we are able to convince, or not convince, to explain well to countries that what is the main aim of the CBAM, and not just explain and to wait until they understand that what we meant on this, but really also to listen them that, okay, what is your view on this, and how do you see it, that what we European believe that this is an ideal and good thing, it's also in your view, what is this? So it's really a kind of two-way to listen each other, and that's what is also in the Clean Industry Act now, to simplify the CBAM and on the partnerships to focus more on listening on this. And I think the diplomacy play here a very important role, because this is exactly the climate diplomacy and energy diplomacy when we need to lead this discussion with countries. Let it be as a entire continent and Africa Union or other corporations or individual countries there. What I learned a lot on the Just Energy Transition Partnership with South Africa, and when we discussed this, and also with other JETPs, that there is a good idea, which is on paper looks very well, that okay, the G7 plus will give a quite significant financial support to countries. In return, they will do a more ambitious energy transition or climate transition. This sounds very great on paper, but when we go into details, there are a lot of questions which was raised already here as well. There's one question which we were not talking too much about, but it is an issue everywhere, also in Europe and also everywhere in the world, and this is the energy price. So the price of the energy. But we need to take into account very much when we are talking about all these issues, and also on the renewable. The renewable itself, in my view, will not solve too many things unless there is also a grid development and the storage issues. That's what I learned in South Africa, that the grid is the most important if we are talking about the greening and other issues. So it's extremely complex, of course, like everywhere. So it's not an Africa-specific issue. This is complex in Europe as well. But if we are able to identify our economic interest, and I think the proposals which was made recently and also in the strategic priorities of the Commission identifies well the interest of Europe and the readiness to work with countries based on this mutual interest and based on these interdependencies for the future as reliable partners. In others also do the same and can identify these things, then the diplomacy will be a major tool to align these things and explain better to each other what are these things. So I don't think that anything can help when Europe wants to tell to anybody that how to do and what to do for different reasons. So it's definitely a kind of understanding each other better and to move into the direction where this mutual interest and this interdependence can help us to identify the way how we could work together. As I mentioned, these proposals which was presented, the Clean Industrial Act and also the partnerships, clean trade and investment partnerships, these are all aimed at things that Europe is ready to cooperate on this, based on this mutual interest with these countries, because we very much believe that still for us, the multilateralism and still for us, the cooperation with different partners is the way how to deal with the common challenges. And if if we see that the geopolitics, the possibilities, the opportunities with what this multilateralism is offer is a bit limited now for different reasons, then we definitely need more focus on partners who are ready and willing to work on this. So this is mainly where I see the role of the diplomacy, and it is definitely, just from this 1 hour what we discussed this issue, a little bit more than 1 hour, it's crystal clear that there are plenty of elements to be clarified, to be seen. One solution might be not good in one country, in another country, but I think kind of common line might be really that if we can articulate good or interest, and if we are ready to discuss this, how to find the common ground on this interest, then it will be a good basis for the partnerships and the work together as well. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Tibor. Yeah, indeed. I mean, one size is not going to fit all, so we also need to take context into account. I do see, though, that we're running towards the close of this session. I saw there was a lot of activity in the chat box, and I am sorry, I thought that we would have time to go through some of the questions, but I see already that some of the speakers have shared their emails very generously with you. If at all, send us emails as well. Have a look at some of the work that we have done. You will see some of these questions, at least we're trying to answer them in some of our work as well. And with that said, I will maybe pass on now to Bruce Byers to close the session. But thank you so much for all the speakers and also for you guys for being so patient and listening to us. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I hope you hear me okay. And thank you very much, everybody, for this very rich discussion. Now, I don't want to take up too much time, so I basically had sort of 4 broad points that I take away from this, but that I think could and should be useful for taking the conversation forward, because I think as ECDPM, we're obviously interested in these kind of discussions, partly just for their own sake, but also because we wanted to feed into something going forward. And I think the framing of this was also to do with the fact that the summit is coming up this year between the AU and EU. And I think this is always something of a challenge, because I think there's always this sense that there should be some meat to these partnerships, but there's always a bit of a kind of a challenge of what are the topics that need to be discussed, how to find these mutual interests that have been mentioned over and over again today. But one of the things I think that's important, and the point I wanted to highlight, is although the summit is coming up and arguably is sort of an important part of what we've been discussing today, obviously when you're looking at the AU-EU relations, this is quite different to what we've actually been talking about, which is more Africa-Europe. So in a way, it kind of relates to very different institutional settings, and then sort of how those institutional settings could or should reflect these broader relations. So I think from what's been mentioned here today, from an ECDPM perspective also, we've been busy looking at sort of trying to understand the interlinkages and these interdependencies. And in a way, what we see is that the EU-AU summit offers a way to put some of those on the table, but the real linkages and the real issues are going to be between sort of African countries and the EU, or if we manage to move there, as Nimrod suggested, doing something around the AFCFTA. But I think what becomes clear is these interlinkages around industrialization and sort of green in parentheses, perhaps, should be one of the bits that sort of, or one of the points that frames the discussions when we come into that summit. So the second point I just wanted to raise then was something which was also put on the table by pretty much all our speakers right from the start, which is that although we're always in search of mutual interests, in fact, the starting points are always quite different. And I think it doesn't really need much repeating to say that the growth, the challenge in Africa is more about growth, not decarbonization. I like Theo's point, particularly saying it's really about cheap electricity. And when you mentioned the fact that sort of 1 kilo of aluminium takes the same amount of electricity as 3,000 households, there are huge differences then and choices that are having to be made. So this discussion of just industrialization, whether or not you're talking green industrialization, itself already raises a whole host of challenges, where in theory, there should be or could be a link with the EU agenda. Now, up until now, of course, a lot of this has been framed in terms of aid and development, in terms of, more recently, in terms of the Global Gateway, which is trying to bring in also private investment. But increasingly, of course, we're now moving, again, as we said, towards this kind of interdependency. And there are even questions for EU industrial competitiveness. So Tibor was mentioning the Draghi report, and basically the concerns about how the EU can retain industrial competitiveness while being green. And does that mean importing green energy to then sort of input into steel, for example, as Alfonso and colleagues have looked at, or does it mean importing green steel? And I think the implications of each are actually quite different. And I think that's sort of another part of the discussion that we need to sort of bring in and retain as a sort of a real life case of where Africa-Europe relations are going to have more or more nuance and have more sort of winners and losers that we need to better understand. So the third point then was to kind of say, well, how can we sort of move towards some kind of sort of agreements that make sense here? Because I think what I picked up from some of the latter comments was that these things often look good on paper. So Tibor, I think, mentioned the jet peas. There was mention of CBAM, which is very much seen as an autonomous, sort of a unilateral measure from the EU, not discussed. Now we're talking about CTIPs, the Clean Trade and Industrial Partnerships mechanisms. But in reality, there's always this question mark about how new are these things? What is the actual availability for creating new mechanisms which are genuinely going to come up and address these mutual interests? How are the sort of power imbalances going to work out? I think in certain cases, there's a sense of a more interest-driven partnership means less hypocrisy, so less sort of discourse about we're here to help, we're here for development, but at the same time striking commercial deals, which are very much about sort of extracting. But at the same time, the way that partnerships have been mentioned, for example, in the recent new European Commission mission letters, partnerships were really about deals. They were really about offtake agreements, in fact. And I think that will become more sort of transactional. Maybe it becomes more honest. But the question is sort of what is it going to mean on the ground? And that's perhaps the final point that I wanted to come to, and is a bit the framing of the whole project that this event has been part of, where what we were trying to do was to really sort of dig into not just the mechanisms and the topics and the what of these sort of linkages around green industrialization, but also the political economy angles. And by that, we mean the actors and the interests and how those play out within the states involved. And this is a bit the point, if we go to the Lobito corridor that was mentioned, to what degree are the states in negotiations actually thinking about sort of the wider population and development benefits, or to what degree is this about actually extracting rents from large contracts? But it's about understanding, therefore, these political economy dynamics within those states and also how those play out between the states. So even the point that Nimrod was making about trying to promote industrialization, I think also Theo mentioned the idea of working regionally, and even the AFCFTA, its ambition is to promote industrialization at a continental level, building on regional initiatives, which themselves are also supposed to promote regional value chains and industrialization. But the challenge is always how to overcome national interests, which may seek national employment priorities, and how to sort of link those with these wider and broader initiatives. And in this case, how can to sort of bring in the EU's interest within those wider issues. So I don't want to take any further than that, than to say this was a super interesting conversation. I think it's obviously a continuation and one that we want to carry on with, especially with our panelists. But we're also very happy to follow up with the other participants that have been sharing messages. And I think really going forward, then the idea is going to have to be less about an EU-AU partnership and much more about really understanding the nitty-gritty, the interest, the incentive that are really going to lead to mutually beneficial partnerships in reality and not just on paper. So thank you very much from my side. And I think thank you to everybody for joining the workshop today.
Thank you very much, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.